Okay, so today we'll talk about the female reproductive system. As I mentioned before, that female reproductive system performs more functions than the male reproductive system. Male reproductive system produces sperm, right? Male gametes or sex cells. Female reproductive system produces female gametes, eggs or ovum. However, female reproductive system performs few other important functions. Fertilization occurs inside the female reproductive system. Then fertilized egg grows and becomes embryo, and embryo becomes fetus inside the female reproductive system. So maintaining the pregnancy, right, is another important function. Also, ovarian cycle, menstrual cycle, those cycles occur in female reproductive system. That's why female reproductive system is more complicated than the male reproductive system. First, we'll see the organs of female reproductive system. Primary female reproductive organs are ovaries. So, female gonads are ovaries. So, we'll talk about the ovaries. Then we'll talk about the ovulation. Ovulation is the process how the ovum or egg is released from the ovary. So we'll see how ovulation occurs or takes place. Then we'll talk about the uterus, another important organ of the female reproductive system. Uterus houses the embryo and fetus. So we'll see the parts of the uterus and the structure of the uterus. Then we'll talk about the regulation of ovarian cycle. As I have mentioned, the two important cycles occur in female reproductive system, right? Ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. So we'll first talk about the ovarian cycle, then we'll also talk about the menstrual cycle. Okay. Parts of the female reproductive system. The primary organs are ovaries. Accessory organs include two uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes. One uterus, one vagina, and the external sex organs. What are the external sex organs? Labius majus or labia majora, labius minus or labia minora, moon pubis, clitoris. So those are the external organs. Here you see the structures of female reproductive system. First you see the white egg like structure. This is just one half of one side of the reproductive system. So you can see one ovary. There are two. You also see the uterine tube or fallopian tube, and then you see that muscular organ, that's the uterus. And then the vagina and the external genital organs, labia majus, labia minus, hymen, clitoris. Those are the external genital organs. Now, the function of the ovary. inside the ovary, the ovum or egg is produced. So production of egg or ovum and the release of it. Those are the functions. Production of ovum and release of the ovum. And after the release of the ovum or egg, the egg is taken into the uterine tube. And uterine tube, what's the function of the uterine tube? Number one, uterine tube takes the egg, released egg, into it, and inside the uterine tube, fertilization takes place. Normally, usually, fertilization occurs inside the uterine tube. That means egg enters into the uterine tube, and by that time the sperm enters into the uterine tube and fertilization occurs. And then fertilized egg is taken into the uterus by the uterine tube. So you got three functions of the uterine tube. It takes the egg after ovulation inside it, fertilization occurs inside it, and fertilized egg is then taken into the uterus by the uterine or fallopian tube. So those are three functions. Then the function of the uterus. Uterus houses the embryo and the fetus. You know that first few weeks of life is the embryonic life, and then the embryo becomes a fetus. So uterus houses the embryo and the fetus. Make sense? Vagina. The function of this organ is number one, the birth takes place through this organ. That's why it is called the birth canal. Birth canal is the vagina. And also this is a female sex organ. So those are two functions. Act as a female sex organ and also act as a birth canal. So those are some important parts and their functions. Now the ligaments in the female reproductive system. There are few ligaments, and ligaments keep the organs in right locations, tie the organs and keep them in right locations. So first, ovarian ligaments anchor ovary medially to the uterus. So ovarian ligament ties the ovary to the uterus, with the uterus. Suspensory ligament anchors ovary laterally to the pelvic wall. So from the ovary to the pelvic wall. Round ligament connects the uterus to the external genitalia, labius majus. So from the uterus to the labius majus or labia majora. That's the round ligament. Broad ligament is a flat connective tissue membrane. So it is not like a it's not a rope-like structure. It is a flat membrane, broad ligament. And broad ligament supports the uterine tubes, uterus and vagina. All those organs are supported by that flat membrane, that is the broad ligament. So broad ligament basically gets attached to the uterine tubes, uterus, vagina, and also the suspensory ligament is located, or it passes through the broad ligament. So here you see those ligaments. First, let's see the ovarian ligament. You see the ovarian ligament connects the ovary to the uterus. So this is the ovarian ligament. From the ovary, the ligament that arises and gets attached to the laterally to the pelvic wall. You know, hip bone is here, your hip bone in both sides. So from the ovary to the medial side of the hip bone, that's the suspensory ligament, this one. And this is the round ligament from the uterus to the labius majus or labia majora, external genitalia. This is the broad ligament, this flat membrane. This entire flat membrane is the broad ligament. Now you see the broad ligament gets attached to the uterus, to the ovary, as well as to the vagina. And also the suspensory ligament runs through the broad ligament. So those are the ligaments in the female reproductive system, and they keep the organs in right locations, support the organs to keep them, to stay them in right locations. Okay. Now the broad ligament has different parts: mesosphinx, mesovarium, and mesometrium. So mesosphinx, mesovarium, and mesometrium. Those are three parts of the broad ligament. You don't really need to remember for the exam those three names, but just for just know that it has three parts. But broad ligament is a flat membrane, and it supports all those structures that I have mentioned. Okay. Now, if you see here, the uterine tube or fallopian tube, it has different parts. The end, the free end of the uterine tube has finger-like structures. You see, those are called fimbriae. Fimbriae are the finger-like structures at the free end of the uterine tube or fallopian tube. And then the part where the finger-like structures or fimbriae are attached, that is called the infundibulum. And then the part that is slightly wider and turns towards the uterus, that turning area is called the ampulla. And then the part that gets attached to the uterus, the last part, is kind of constricted, narrow. That part is called the isthmus. So the part that gets attached to the uterus, it is slightly constricted and is called the isthmus. So those are the parts of the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. Now, you see, if you think your two upper limbs, these are the fallopian or uterine tubes, okay? And this body is what? Uterus, right? You can think, although I don't want to be a uterus. These two are the uterine tubes, and this is the uterus, right? So these fingers are what? Fimbriae. Make sense? Fimbriae. And the fimbriae are attached to my hand, right? Palm. This is called what? Infundibulum. Infundibulum, where the fimbriae are attached to, right? And then the turning point is what? Ampulla. Okay? And the part is attached to the uterus, that is the isthmus. Okay? So those are, and this part is the main part of the fallopian tube, or uterine tube also called the body of the uterine tube or fallopian tube, the rest part. Okay, so these are what? Fimbriae. This part, infundibulum, and this is ampulla, and this is the isthmus, right? Fertilization occurs usually, in most of the cases, in the ampulla of the uterine tube, in this part. That means what happens, you see, this is your ovary and these are fimbriae. Ovulation releases the egg, right? Ovulation releases the egg or ovum, and fimbriae are doing what? Always moving like this and trying to capture the egg. So that's why fimbriae are there. They are trying to capture the egg, take the ovum or egg inside. Okay. So most of the cases the egg will enter into the uterine tube, and when the egg or ovum will reach here in the ampulla, sperm should reach there. Okay. So normally that happens. Sperm travels long way, right, and reaches here, and egg or ovum travels little bit. And when they reach there in the ampulla, they meet, and that meeting is called what? Fertilization. Fertilization of the egg. So fertilization is the meeting or union of the egg and the sperm. Is it clear? It is like, you got your friend's call that I'm coming to see you. Okay. And you are very happy. So what you will do? You will first clean the house, right? And make soft bed for your friend. Make sure that he or she feels comfortable, right? So you'll make sure the bed is soft and nice, and then you'll go to the airport, right, to receive your friend. Your friend is coming from, for example, Florida, right? Long way. So sperm travels long way and ovum travels a little bit, right? So you are going to the airport and your friend is coming from far, and you are meeting in the airport, right? At the airport, and that is what? The uterus, right? No, the ampulla of the uterine tube. Make sense? And then after you meet your friend, you drive your friend in your house, right? So the fertilized egg is the meeting, and you are bringing your friend, you are together coming into the house. That's the uterus. House is the uterus. Make sense? And uterus, inside the uterus, a nice soft bed is formed because the fertilized egg is coming. So uterus makes a nice soft bed, and the fertilized egg sticks into that bed, and that is called implantation. Fertilized egg enters into the uterus and gets stick to the bed, and that is called the implantation of the fertilized egg. And then the fertilized egg becomes the embryo and then becomes the fetus. Yes?
So what causes ectopic pregnancies?
Okay, so it's a good question. So I told you that the fimbriae capture the egg, right? If fertilization occurs outside of the uterine tube, for example, if the fimbriae fails to capture the egg, then what will happen? The egg will drop, right, and will get attached to any structure. The egg can get attached to the outer surface of the uterus or anywhere else, and the sperm will get out and will fertilize that. So for example, if the egg is attached here, did not enter, and the sperm will come and will fertilize. Anywhere outside is the ectopic pregnancy. Also, if fertilization occurs inside the uterine tube or fallopian tube, but the fertilized egg is not moving towards the uterus, gets stick to the wall of the uterine tube anywhere and will start to grow there. That is also ectopic pregnancy. So anywhere else, if the fertilized egg grows and fails to enter into the house, go to the house, enter into the uterus, that is ectopic pregnancy. It can happen outside of the uterine tube or inside the uterine tube. Make sense? But it is not going into the uterus. So outside of the uterus, the embryo, the fertilized egg will start to multiply and will get bigger, right? Usually, the ectopic means false, right? Ectopic means what? False pregnancy. So, the person will show the symptoms of pregnancy, but that fertilized egg will not survive. After several multiplication, then the embryo will die because that's not the right place for the embryo to grow, right? House is the uterus, right? Inside the uterus, you have nice bed, and that bed contains a lot of nutrition to keep it alive. But if it happens outside of the bed, then it will not survive. Eventually, it will die. Okay, so that's the ectopic or false pregnancy. Okay, ovaries, the primary female reproductive organs. The outer covering is a fibrous tunica albuginea, and inside the ovary you have outer cortex, inner medulla. So if you cut the ovary, inside the ovary you'll see the outer part and inner part. Outer part is the cortex and inner part is the medulla. Okay, the blood vessels enter into the inner part like this, and outer part is very important because in the outer part the ovum or egg get mature. So these round structures are called the follicles. So these are follicles. The follicles grow in the cortex, outer part, and the most mature follicle, when it gets very mature, it gets soft, and at one point it will rupture and will release the ovum or egg. So inside the follicle you have ovum or egg, and the follicles grow in the cortex, and when it gets very mature it gets soft and rupture, and the rupture of the follicle releases the egg to the outside of the ovary, and that is called the ovulation. Okay, that is the ovulation. Release of the egg to the outside of the ovary. That occurs due to the rupture of the follicle, mature follicle. Now, we'll see different stages of maturation of the follicles. Okay, the stages of maturation of follicle. The earliest stage is the primordial follicle. Then the primordial follicle becomes the primary follicle, and primary follicle becomes the secondary, and then secondary becomes the late secondary follicles, and the most mature stage is called the Graafian follicle. So most mature follicles are the Graafian follicles. And Graafian follicles are very soft, ready to rupture. It is like fruit in the tree. First when it is small, it is hard, right? Then it grows, gets big, and when it gets ripe, it becomes what? Soft, right? Soft, and at one point it will rupture. The seed will come out, right? So seed is the ovum or egg, right? And the whole fruit is what? The follicle. Make sense? So when the follicle will rupture, the seed or ovum or egg will come out, and that is called the ovulation. Okay. So those are the different stages of follicles during maturation. So this is the ovulation, and then after the ovulation, what happens? The rest part of the Graafian follicle stays there and becomes the corpus luteum. So after the rupture of the follicle, the ovum gets out, but the remaining part of the follicle becomes corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is an yellow colored structure that stays there and act as a temporary gland inside the ovary. So corpus luteum acts as what? As a temporary gland inside the ovary and releases three hormones: estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. These three hormones are released by the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum will remain there as a temporary gland for about 14 days. How long? 14 days. That's why we say it is a temporary gland. But there is a condition. The condition is it will remain there for 14 days and then it will be destroyed if no fertilization occurs. Usually fertilization doesn't occur during the ovarian cycle is happening one after another, right? If fertilization doesn't occur, the corpus luteum will stay for 14 days. But if fertilization occurs, if this egg is fertilized by a sperm, then what will happen? The corpus luteum will decide to stay longer for about 3 months. For about 3 months. Fertilization has occurred. Means what? Pregnancy has started. Make sense? Pregnancy has started. So if pregnancy starts, it will stay for how long? 3 months. And will keep working as a temporary gland and keep releasing these three hormones. Is it clear? So you see, this is the entire ovarian cycle happening in the cortex. And this part, when the follicles are growing, this part is called the follicular phase. Makes sense, right? Follicular phase, because follicles are growing, getting matured. Is it clear? Follicles are growing and getting what? Matured. That's the follicular phase. And this is called what? So this is number 1. This is what? Rupture of the follicles. That is called the ovulation. Rupture of the follicle and release of the egg. This is the ovulation. Phase number 2. And then this part is the corpus luteum. So this phase is called the luteal So you see, entire ovarian cycle has three phases. Follicular phase, the growth and maturation of follicles. Ovulation, the rupture of the Graafian follicle and release of egg is the ovulation. And then the corpus luteum is formed and it stays there 14 days. For 14 days, that's the luteal phase. Make sense? And this one, the duration is about 14 days. And ovulation, does it take time? Days? No, it just rupture, huh? Right? So it's the rupture of the follicle. So it doesn't take day. It just occurs. So 0 day. And corpus luteum stays for how long? I said 14 days, right? If fertilization doesn't occur. So that's the 14 days. So total how many days the ovarian cycle? 28. 14 plus 14. Makes sense? So total duration is about 28 days. So the ovarian cycle has three phases. Follicular phase, 14 days, when the follicles grow and get mature, ovulation, and then luteal phase. Then after 14 days, the corpus luteum will be disturbed and another egg will get matured and will be released. Okay. Here you see, now you will understand. You see the outer cortex, inner medulla. Medulla has the blood vessels. Cortex is important because the follicles grow and get matured there. Okay. And after ovulation, you see the Graafian follicle becomes the corpus luteum, that yellow structure. Why it looks yellow? Because a lot of adipose tissue or fat accumulates inside it. Okay. Uterus. We have talked about the uterine tube and parts of it. Now we'll see the structure of the uterus. Uterus has a thick wall and a cavity inside. If you see the wall of the uterus, the wall has three layers. Outermost layer is the perimetrium. Peri means around, outermost. And then middle thick layer is the myometrium, which is muscular. Myo means muscle. And innermost layer is the endometrium. Endo means inside. So perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. Those are the three layers in the wall of the uterus. Now, where the bed, soft bed is formed? Inside, right? Inside the uterus. So endometrium forms that soft bed I mentioned before to receive the fertilized egg. So endometrium is the layer, innermost layer, and sometimes it becomes very thick and soft, and sometimes it gets very thin, almost disappears. Why? Because if you see, after you go to the airport and you are waiting there, and if you see no sign of your friend, he or she didn't show up, then what will happen? You will get angry, right? Upset, and will come to your home and will destroy the bed, right? You don't need the bed anymore. So you will. So uterus does the same thing. If fertilization doesn't occur, uterus will do what? Destroy the bed, right? Destroy the endometrium. That's why sometimes the endometrium is very thick and soft, because the bed is ready. It is preparing the bed, right? It is making the thick, soft bed. But if the fertilization doesn't occur, the bed will be destroyed. The endometrium will be destroyed and will get out from the body, and that's the menstruation or means we say that menstruation is the destruction of the endometrium of the uterus and removal of the destroyed tissue. We'll talk about that later. Just know that that's the endometrium. The soft bed of endometrium is formed and is destroyed. So every time it is happening until the fertilization occurs. Now, if you see the parts of the uterus, the top part in between two uterine tubes, that part, top part like this, dome shape, that is called the fundus. It is like the fundus of the stomach. And then the middle part, wide middle part, is the body of the uterus. And then in the lower part, first the constricted area, that is called the isthmus. Isthmus is constricted part. And the isthmus of the uterine tube I have mentioned, that constricted part gets attached to the uterus, right? So isthmus means the constricted part. So isthmus, and the lower end is called the cervix. So the uterus has a fundus, body, isthmus, and the lower end, that is inside the vagina, that is the cervix of the uterus. Now, the cavity inside the uterus is called the uterine cavity. Make sense? Uterine cavity. And you know that fertilized egg gets stick to the endometrium, that is called the implantation, and after implantation the fertilized egg grow and becomes the embryo and then fetus, and then the fetus gets out through the cervical canal. You see inside the cervix there is a canal, that is called the cervical canal, and then through the vagina or birth canal. Okay. Now we'll talk about the endometrium, innermost layer of the uterus, and this layer changes. You know that sometimes it gets very thick and soft to receive the fertilized egg. Sometimes it gets very thin, almost disappears because of the destruction. So, if you see the endometrium has two layers in it. Endometrium has two layers. The functional layer and the basilar layer. So this is the whole thing is the endometrium. Endometrium, and inner layer is the functional layer. This part is the functional layer, and this part is called the basilar layer or basal layer. Same thing, okay? It says basal layer. So you can okay. So endometrium has two layers, functional and basal, or stratum functionalis and stratum basalis. Now, this basal layer is fixed, will not change. The functional layer is destroyed. If fertilization doesn't occur, the functional layer is destroyed completely. Whole functional layer will be destroyed, and then again new functional layer will be formed. Again it will be destroyed, and again new functional layer will be formed. The functional layer is here, destroyed completely, then again new functional layer will start to grow. and will be formed and will be destroyed again. Okay, so that's how the endometrium changes. Okay, but stratum basilis will remain there, will not be destroyed. Okay. Now, if you see the blood supply in the uterus, it is important. Why? Because the destruction of the functional layer occurs due to the constriction of the blood vessels enter into it. So, what happens? Two types of blood vessels we see here: straight arteries and spiral arteries. Spiral, these are spiral arteries. So, constriction occurs in the spiral arteries that supplies blood to the stratum functionalis or functional layer. So, constriction of the spiral arteries occur, and that causes the destruction of this layer, because when constriction occurs, no blood is supplied to the functionalis layer, and due to the lack of blood circulation, the destruction occurs in this layer. Okay, and that is the menstruation. So here you see the straight and spiral arteries. The spiral arteries supply blood to the stratum functionalis, functional layer, this part. This is the spiral artery. So when the constriction occurs here, no blood will go there and the layer will be destroyed. Okay. Another structure of female reproductive system, which is called the birth canal, is the vagina. If you see the wall of the vagina, it has three layers. Outermost covering is fibroelastic adventitia. Then inner muscular layer is the smooth muscle, it's called muscularis. And then innermost layer is the stratified squamous. Now, stratified means many layers, right? Multiple layers of squamous cells. And you already know that the areas where the chance of getting friction is high is lined with stratified squamous. We already know that. Now, this stratified squamous is very thick and there are foldings in it, folds in it, and those folds are called rugae. Have you seen rugae before? Inside the and bladder, urinary bladder, right? So also you have rugae in the vagina. Okay. Now we'll see the process of the formation of the egg or ovum, that is called oogenesis. The process of formation of ovum or egg, which is also called oocyte. Same thing, egg, ovum, oocyte, is called oogenesis. You know that the process of formation of sperm is spermatogenesis, right? So similarly, this is oogenesis. Now, interesting thing about the oogenesis is this process starts in very early stage of life, when the female or girl is in mother's uterus. So even before the birth of the baby girl, the oogenesis starts inside the ovary. So that is very interesting. Then it starts, but is halted, stopped until the puberty. So after birth, when the girl reaches at age 13 or 14 at puberty, then it starts again. So it's almost like 14 years it is halted or stopped. And after puberty, in each month, a few primary oocytes get activated and one is selected each month to go through meiosis 1. And the result of meiosis, you know that meiosis occurs in 2 steps that I explained to you in last class, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. First, meiosis 1, you must remember meiosis 1 is 46 or 2n, reduces the number to half and n. And then meiosis 2, okay, produces total 4. So when meiosis 2 is completed, from 1 cell we get 4. So the meiosis 1 produces 2, but among these 2, one is healthy and another is unhealthy in oogenesis. When meiosis 1 occurs, most of the cellular materials enter into one site, to one cell. The other one lacking of cellular materials. So this one is unhealthy one, non-functional one. This is the functional one, the good one. Okay, but both are the cells. Then this is called the first polar body. First polar body, unhealthy one. Okay. Then what happens? Both will multiply and will go through meiosis 2. This polar body, the weak one, will produce 2 more polar bodies. These are second polar bodies. Second polar bodies. Okay. So these 2 are again unhealthy, non-functional. Now let's see what happens in meiosis 2 of the healthy one. When this one divides, most of the materials will go to one side and only small amount of materials will go to this side. So this one becomes unhealthy, this is healthy. So although after meiosis 2 we get 4 new cells, 3 of them are polar bodies, non-functional, and 1 is healthy and functional. That's why when we get the meiosis 2 completed, we get only 1 ovum or egg, which is very important. If we get more than 1, if we get 2 ovum or eggs at the same time, sperm are so many, right? So many sperm. So they will fertilize both eggs easily and 2 embryo will be formed, right? So we don't want that normally. We want 1 egg, and that happens normally. 1 egg is released every time. Okay, other 3 become non-functional. Okay, so first polar body and second polar body, and then we get 1 healthy ovum or egg. Here you see the steps of oogenesis. First, if you see the top part, you see in the left top, before birth. Before birth, what happens? You know that both mitosis and meiosis occur in both spermatogenesis and oogenesis, because mitosis occurs in all cells, right, including the sex cells. So mitosis will occur first, and that will occur before the birth of the baby girl, when the girl is in mother's uterus, just to do her to produce new cells. Mitosis is to increase the number I mentioned in last class. So from the stem cell, which is called oogonium, stem cell stage is called oogonium, and mitosis of stem cell will produce the primary oocyte, and then primary oocyte will become the, let's see, the primary oocyte. Yeah, inside the, so here what they have shown the follicles and the egg inside it. So in the right side, you see the maturation of the follicles that we have already talked about, right? In the cortex of the ovary, the follicles get matured. So you see the stages in the right side, the primordial follicle, the earliest stage, and then the primary follicle, secondary follicle, late secondary follicle, and then the Graafian follicle. Those are the stages, okay? And Graafian follicle is the most mature stage. It ruptures and the egg or ovum comes out, okay? And in the left side, you see the egg or ovum inside the follicle. So in the left side, just see that meiosis, first mitosis occurs to produce new egg, and then meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. But meiosis 1 starts after puberty, okay, at puberty. And then you see when the meiosis 1 is completed, one healthy and one polar body is formed. Then again here, interestingly, the meiosis 2 will start but will not be completed until the sperm fertilizes the egg. So you see here, if you look here, meiosis 1 and here the meiosis 2. But meiosis 2 will occur or will be completed when the sperm gets attached to the egg. Then the meiosis 2 will be finished. So that is another interesting thing. So here during oogenesis, you see three interesting things happen. One is the oogenesis starts before the birth of the baby girl, and then it stays halted for about 14 years. After birth, it will stay like that for 14 years, and when the puberty will start, at puberty the meiosis 1 will start the division, and then after the sperm gets attached to the egg, then the meiosis 2 is completed, okay? And finally we get one mature healthy egg, ovum, and 3 polar bodies. Okay, we have talked about ovulation. We have talked about the corpus luteum, estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. Those 3 hormones are released from the corpus luteum, which acts as a temporary gland. Now, we'll see the regulation of ovulation, how the ovulation is controlled. So, the pituitary hormones, you know that pituitary gland has anterior and posterior lobes. Anterior pituitary gland or anterior lobe produces 6 hormones. Among those 6 hormones, 2 hormones regulate the ovarian cycle. One is the follicular stimulating hormone and the other is the luteinizing hormone. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH is the luteinizing hormone. Come from the anterior pituitary. Okay, you see here in the picture. Number 1 is anterior pituitary. Those two hormones are released and work on the growing follicles. Work on what? On the where you will find the growing follicles. Outer cortex. Very good. Outer cortex of what? The ovary, right? Outer part of the ovary where the follicles are growing. I have shown you. So these two hormones will go there and will work on the follicles, right? The first one, follicle stimulating hormone. Its name is telling it, right? It will work on the follicles and will stimulate the growth and maturation of the follicles. That's why it is called follicle stimulating hormone. Go to the outer cortex of the ovary and stimulates the growth of the follicles. And now, first the function of luteinizing hormone. It helps in the rupture of the follicle. Helps in the rupture of the Graafian follicle. That means help in what? Ovulation, right? You know that rupture of the follicle will release the egg, and that is the ovulation. We know that. So growth is helped by which one? Which hormone? Yes, and the ovulation is helped by luteinizing hormone. Is it clear? Okay, so those are the two main functions of those two hormones. Just before the Graafian follicle ruptures, plenty of luteinizing hormone is suddenly released. Just before the rupture of the follicle, plenty of luteinizing hormone or LH is suddenly released from the anterior pituitary, and that is called luteinizing hormone surge. Sudden release of plenty of luteinizing hormone, and that causes the rupture of the follicle and release of the egg. Okay? Now those two hormones help in the growth and maturation and ovulation. Is it clear? Okay. Now you know that after the ovulation, the corpus luteum is formed, right? And acts as what? Temporary gland, right? And starts to release those three hormones: estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, right? So that's you see in the bottom right, the corpus luteum is releasing those three hormones. And you see the dotted line is showing that those three hormones inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Those three hormones inhibit the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Now you tell me, if anterior pituitary is inhibited, those two hormones will be released more or will not be released? Which one? You are inhibiting the anterior pituitary, right? So it will release or not release? Not release. Make sense? So if the follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone is not released for 14 days, right? What will happen? The new follicle will not get matured, no rupture will occur. Make sense? And that's what happens. After ovulation, there is a gap for the next one to start, right? And otherwise, what will happen? One rupture, then another will rupture, right? Then another will rupture. And the eggs will start to get released one after another. That doesn't happen, right? One egg in 1 month or 28 days. So that's why you need the inhibition to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. So no FSH, no LH will be released, and no ovulation will occur for that period. Now, if fertilization occurs, I said how long the corpus luteum will stay. It will decide to stay longer, right? How long? 3 months. Very good. That is also very important. You know that if pregnancy occurs, fertilization means pregnancy has started, right? Ovulation should not occur. Ovulation stops, right? Now the question is then why 3 months, not during entire pregnancy? Because 3 months the corpus luteum will stay there and will act as a temporary gland and will release those 3 hormones to stop ovulation, right? As long as corpus luteum is there, no ovulation will occur. Make sense? After 3 months, what happens? The placenta performs the same function, act as a temporary gland and release those hormones. So you don't need the corpus luteum anymore because placenta has taken over the function, okay? And will start to release those hormones. And they will stop the hypothalamus and pituitary. Make sense? So, and then when placenta will get out with the fetus, then again everything will start to work as usual. So that's the regulation of the ovulation or ovarian cycle. Okay. So we'll stop here. We have enough time. So we'll